right, good afternoon. All right, so here we go. The task that I have is to provide a quick summary of the lessons that we've learned for the past 15 years, working with schools across the country that are implementing PBIS. What we're really interested in, though, is moving way beyond just any one content area. We want to talk about math, we want to talk about reading, we want to talk about writing, we want to be able to talk not just about PBIS in schools, but how to help juvenile justice environments. Realistically, this is really a session talking about what are we learning about building things that get implemented with fidelity and actually sustain over time. As with each of the presenters, I have a real obligation to acknowledge a whole host of people. I mean, you can't talk about sustainability without having a history that you bring. So both a long history of the people that have worked within PBIS. We actually work closely with Karen and Dean Fixon. So within the CSEP community, there's actually been some real changes in the way that things have occurred. And no one can talk about sustainability without giving a call out both to those schools that have been successful. And we now have schools that have implemented PBIS at fidelity for over 15 years, all right? But as you all know, we learn as much or more from the schools that don't sustain, right? So we listen and we try and adapt and move forward. Anytime we go forward, let's stop and say, okay, we're talking about how to sustain effective practices. So what is sustainability? Sustainability essentially is durable implementation of a practice, right? So the practice is implemented with a level of fidelity that it actually continues to generate effective outcomes. Now, the key there is I want you to focus on this notion of outcomes. It's not just that you keep doing exactly the same thing. In fact, we're going to argue that sustainability is always about adapting. But it's about adapting to how the environment changes while still getting essentially the same outcomes. The reason this is so important, a great special educator, a guy named Glenn Latham, in 1988, drew this picture and he said, look, how many times, remember, come on, most of us were teachers or administrators. You're in a school and look at the curve. It starts, everybody's excited, you go about a year or so, you get it implemented, right? Just about the time you get it implemented, then it all falls out, right? And then the most frustrating thing is you replicate that over and over and over. And what that means is when you walk into a school and you say, Cowboy, I am here and I've got this great thing, people say, we have been through this curve over and over and the likelihood I'm going to sweat blood for you is low. All right, we got to change that. Here's the bottom line. From now on, every practice that we have documented as being evidence-based, when we walk into schools now, I want you to start with a message that says, look, we're going to give you the technical support you need to implement this with the tools that will allow it to sustain for a minimum of a decade. All right? So from now on, put this in your grant proposals. We want to build systems that will sustain for a minimum of a decade. Within a decade, we expect somebody who's younger and smarter to have developed something that's better, okay? But for now, let's start with that. So if we use PBIS as an example, what are some of the things that we've learned? Well, most of you know, PBIS is not a hard curriculum. It's a framework that actually was designed by OSEP as a goal. We have drawn from many, many different sources, but it actually has evidence-based practices. And in fact, most of the things that we come up with are not a practice, but they're bundles of practices. And in part, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to document what are really the core features. And George Sugai really is the person who took a number of these practices. He didn't come up with the practices, but he put them together. George's message to us was, if you really want to get the social and academic outcomes that schools are expected to do, you must attend to the whole school culture. School culture matters just as much as teaching good reading. If you're going to do change in a school culture, even though we were all trained as teachers to make classroom 9 good, you've got to think about the whole school. In terms of putting school-wide systems in place, you won't be able to actually get it in place because you've got to have 32 humans who actually behave differently. To do that, you need to actually focus on the systems, the policies, the funding, the teaming, the data structure. And one of the most important things that we took, and we got this initially from Hill Walker, and then we borrowed a great deal from the works that the Fuchs were doing on RTI, is everything we do has to be delivered with multiple tiers. And the multiple tier is really altering this whole notion of the way that we organize support. Now, during the past 15 years, there's been a wealth of randomized controlled trials, single case trials, evaluation trials that basically allow us to say at this point, if as a school you implement PBIS with fidelity, you'll get a 20 to 60% reduction in office discipline referrals. You will, over a 3-year period, get an increase in academic performance. At least in elementary schools, we can document that. An increase in both in oral reading fluency and an increase in the proportion of kids who meet the state standard. In middle school and high school, you're more likely to get the kids to actually show up. Heck of a deal, not a bad thing. The school will be perceived as a safer environment. There'll be a decrease in bullying behaviors, an increase in organizational efficiency. And interestingly, for the people who are actually keeping track of budgets, you will decrease staff turnover. Your staff will identify what they do as being more effective. And most recently, largely to the work of Catherine Bradshaw, we can now say if you implement PBIS with fidelity, you'll actually get an improvement in the social emotional competence of kids. All right, what have we learned from that, though, about how we actually sustain things? Thing number one is we've learned that we've got to pay attention to the levels of the system. Students need to always be the unit of analysis. Everything that we do needs to be tied back to kid outcomes. But if we only do that, we will not produce sustainable effects. Schools, for us, are the unit of intervention. Any intervention that is at less than the school level is not an intervention that will be sustainable. So if you've got a classroom management system, embed it in what the school systems are. Districts, for those of you who are implementing technical assistance centers, districts are the unit of implementation. Implementation is driven in the United States by law and by funding structure at the district level. School boards are at the district level. States are a unit of coordination. They can make a difference, but we do not have a top-down structure where states dictate what goes on, as most state directors will tell you over and over. The key is going to be over and over and over focused on the district level. So part of what we've learned is we've got to take the multi-tiered system that everyone here knows and loves, and we've got to attach that to technical assistance. So what does it mean if you have a district that is a basic technical assistance environment, a district that is a targeted technical assistance environment? And we all know and love the district that is a red district, right? All right, or a district that needs higher intensity supports. So we have learned that it's not just about organizing technical assistance so that we operate at the state, the district, the school, and the student level. We've learned that we've got to really focus on the districts, and we have to be able to deliver different levels of technical assistance if we're going to get to sustainable effects. We currently work with 19,054 schools across the United States. All right, it's taken a long time, but we keep count. This is the breakout by state. I know if you're over 40, you can't read the little, those are states down at the bottom, they're alphabetical. But the real key is we've got over 13 states that have over 500 schools that are implementing. Now, if we look at that and we say, what have you learned about scaling up and sustaining? I mean, beyond the numbers, what can you say? Here's one of the first things we can say. You will not scale up or sustain something unless people will kill to get it. All right? So start with high priority. If we walk in and we say, we are from the OSEP Technical Assistance Center on PBIS and we're here to help you, we don't get much. If we walk in and say, do your children behave in a way that you are comfortable with? Would you like them to behave better? Is their behavior a barrier to academic success? What is the smallest, fastest, cheapest, most effective way to change behavior? in a way that'll make this a more effective learning environment. Are you interested? They are interested in that. So of all the things that we've learned, we've got to attach things to very, very, very high priority. Second is effectiveness. One of the biggest shames in the United States right now is schools throughout the country are working extraordinarily hard to do things that are ineffective. We need to do a much better job of helping schools actually invest in things that are proven as being effective. And part of that is being very clear, not just what the name is or who thought of it. Those are not important. We got to get over creating religions, and we got to come back to really focusing on function. What is it you do? For whom do you do it? What are the skills that are necessary? What's the context where it happens? And boy, over and over, what do I get if I do this? If we do that, then here's what I want. And of all the things that I say, this is the thing I want you to write down. I want you to focus on efficiency. The most underrated feature that focuses on scaling up and sustainability is focusing on the efficiency with which interventions work and the efficiency with which technical assistance can produce an effect. We have too many great things that work really wonderfully as long as you've got 5 graduate students who can pull it off, right? And I love graduate students. They're very, very intelligent. They work extraordinarily hard for almost nothing, and I recommend that everybody get one, all right? But it's not the way that we're going to change the world. So in part, I think of the things that I need. You know, Bob Algazine, I need you to come up with a metric of efficiency. And I need us to be holding ourselves accountable for efficiency over and over. Last piece is going to be data. And my goodness, at this conference, you haven't gone to one session where people didn't fidelity are not necessarily the variables that sustain fidelity. So in part of what we're learning is, we're learned in part from that we need to do a much better job of focusing on fidelity measures. So if you look at, remember this graph, the graph of the number of schools implementing PBIS, we recently said, okay, well, how many of those this year actually measured fidelity? And that's what the red bars are. Of the ones that measured fidelity, how many actually met criterion? So in part, from now on, when people talk about are we doing that, ask those measures. Kent McIntosh has been conducting a series of studies recently. He's looking at the extent to which we can sustain and identify the variables that are most likely to impact sustainability. He's got a measure called Subsist, and several of you have been recruiting schools. We currently are monitoring 805 schools that are implementing PBIS. So for those of you who have helped us to recruit those schools, many thanks. All right, part of what we can tell you is that the factor structure is holding. That's boring. The real thing we can say is, at this point, the variables that affect the likelihood a school will implement PBIS: commitment to focus on behavior, administrator support, teaching expected behaviors. But the variables most unlikely to affect sustainability, is whether it actually gets implemented at a level of indigenous unit, the classroom unit. When we get classroom PBS being implemented, very good indicator that it will sustain. The other thing is, getting it implemented depends on focusing on kid outcomes. Getting it to sustain requires focus on fidelity data. Two different types of things, and then building the district capacity. So the other thing that I will end with is, as we have been looking at increasing the ability of schools to sustain factors, we tried to pull in some experts to give us consultative advice on what they have learned and what their perceptions are. And most recently, we asked Kent's son, Mason, to give us his thoughts on what are the most effective strategies really for moving forward and building sustainable practices. And he really gave us three key messages. One is, he said, start early. And as Jennifer said, we want to start right at the beginning. Sustainability is not something you build at the end, it's something you start with at the beginning. Build the infrastructure as you teach and train the first schools. Second big message is use your data, right? And don't just collect the data, you got to actually use the data. Now I want you to look at the fact, he's worried about the baseline levels. He's worried. No, seriously, all right? And then the other big message that he gave us is, if you're really going to sustain, I want you to use the data over time. You got to really gnaw on the data. You've got to not just look at it and set it aside. You've got to use it in a problem-solving format. So the big message that we would give, all right, I'm encouraged that schools have the ability to actually build, implement, and sustain effective practices. I'm worried that we must do better in terms of helping them. And a large part of that is going to come back to the collection of both fidelity data and impact data. And in part, what I would argue is we need to move away from, data being a bumper sticker to data being the license plate. All right? So with that, I turn it to Karen. We'll go there. Thank you.